Walter Greenleaf and Beth Rojazinski. They're going to have a great panel on augmented reality and virtual reality and how it'll impact healthcare going forward. Both of these people have some impressive backgrounds, so I'll just kind of condense it. Beth is a serial entrepreneur, technology professional, business strategist, and has spent the last several years on digital medicine. She's a founding member of the multimedia studies at SFSU. She's worked in hardware, software, and services, Silicon Graphics, Macromedia, digital agency Circle, and has since founded games and apps companies and published over 30 games and apps, mostly in the health and wellness space. Walter is a behavioral neuroscientist and medical technology developer at Stanford University. He has 3 decades of research and development experience in the field of digital medicine and medical virtual reality technology, and has been considered a leader in this field. He's developed numerous clinical systems over the last 30 years, and I'll just do a small sample.
It's okay.
Okay. All right. I'm sure you'll get more of that in the talk itself and what they actually do and what they're doing. So my pleasure to introduce you, and good luck on the rest of the time.
Thank you for the introduction. And Beth, I have to ask you, when you say serial entrepreneur, you don't mean Battle Creek, do you?
No cornflakes. So we were introduced as a panel, and this is actually kind of really a small group of a panel, right? It's just the 2 of us, and so what we will be doing instead of doing a panel, but we will make ourselves available to answer whatever questions that you have, is giving a quick overview and a presentation of this area of how we actually have been involved in transforming healthcare with immersive technology. As Varun, when he introduced me, suggested, I've produced over 30 games and apps. Walter and I actually were both involved with the formation of the first company to have a digital app approved for medical by the FDA, and that's Pear Therapeutics. So thank you. So we've been involved in clinical and across the board. One of the things that you'll see here are some of the companies that we work with, and you can see by our conjoined backgrounds that we actually have a lot of experience in both the worlds of academia as well as commercial and for-profit world. So we've kind of got boots on the ground in both of these worlds. And what we want to talk about today is really that, right? This is where the rubber meets the road with digital medicine and digital healthcare is if you can actually bring it out of the laboratory and academia and have it find a home in a commercial setting. And we both actually have some level of expertise at doing this translation from academia, and Walter actually works with a number of different startups. Do you want to talk really quickly about how your startups are doing?
Oh, well, my biggest problem with the medical startups, most of them come from the tech sector, a few come from the special effects area in Hollywood, but all of them make the mistake of saying they're building the next killer app. And you don't do that in medicine.
There you go. So no killer apps, but what we will talk about is how we are transforming healthcare with immersive technology. And one of the reasons, one of the things that I want to talk about and start with is we're not actually applying technology for technology's sake. We're applying technology because there's this huge unmet need in our world, and current systems of care are not doing a good enough job. I mean, when we can get it to people, it actually does a decent job, but we're not getting it out to enough people. And with a lot of the disorders that we look at, when we look at mental and behavioral health in particular, we can approach them from a holistic perspective, almost as if they're a learning disorder. And so this gives us an opportunity with immersive technology to kind of retrain how patients approach their disorders and their disease and how they approach health in general. So one of the things that we're going to talk about here today is how digital medicines actually create value across a spectrum. And you'll see here that I've got, a couple of the things that have been happening in Hollywood. There's actually, favorable reimbursement of this. And, one of the things that I'd like to note here is even regardless of what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, the train has left the station. Payers are waking up to the fact that they need to get involved earlier, that preventive services are actually a wise investment. As you probably also know, there are a few pharmacotherapies actually on the horizon, especially for mental health. And kind of famously, if not infamously, a number of big pharma companies have divested themselves of their CNS and neuro pipelines. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, and we'll both kind of touch on this as we're talking, is that these things have been proven to be efficacious. There have been a number of studies over the past several decades of the fact that, immersive technologies, games and apps for mental and behavioral health actually really do work. So I talk about mental and behavioral health, and in part it's because there's this crisis of non-communicable diseases. It's the fastest growing burden of illness and death around the world. And not only is it the fastest growing cause of death around the world, and this is, because we've been lucky enough to eradicate a lot of, viral disorders and disease, but the interesting thing here when we talk about non-communicable diseases is that there are growing numbers of people who are chronically affected and may be affected with a serious disorder for decades of their lives. So as an example here, we can think about things like obesity and diabetes that are affecting people at a younger and younger age. And if you have a 12-year-old that's already becoming affected with type 2 diabetes, this is a disorder that may take them through the rest of their lives, right? And so we've got this issue of these chronic diseases that are going on and enhancing a burden for us. Non-communicable diseases are also, in many cases, decreasing life expectancy. In America, it's actually noted that working class white men now live less long because of some of these disorders and diseases. And globally, it's a near $50 trillion cost. In the CNS spectrum, and we talk about CNS as psychiatry, neurology, and pain, there's just this vast unmet need, and the company that we helped to start and a number of the companies that we work with are involved in psychiatry, neurology, and pain. Up to 80% of the world market for these disorders is either unserved or underserved. This is a company called Neuro Insights that's been evaluating this. In certain areas of the world, India, for example, where there are 1 billion people, there are reportedly about 4,000 psychiatrists for 1 billion people. So talk about your waiting line. There's long waits across the board, and one of the first therapeutic that Pear Therapeutics has had approved is for substance use disorder and opioid use disorder. By some reports, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, only 1 in 10 persons who are looking for help with their disorder actually gets the help that they need. And the costs and consequences of mental illness are just staggering. These numbers, if we add together, the neurological conditions and mental health disorders here, we can see that this is, about 20% of disability-adjusted life years that this is costing across the board. So I mentioned that, in starting this, that current existing healthcare is not doing a good enough job. And in part, it's not because we don't actually have the means and the wherewithal to do it, but the requirements, are really not scalable as they stand. They're very expensive, right? And so when I talk about psychiatry, neurology, and pain, there's about 1 pain medicine doc for every 10,000 patients in chronic pain that are out there. If we're talking about mental health disorders, in the city of San Francisco, the average cost for a therapist is about $200 an hour. In New York City, it's about $300 an hour. And so when we look at the vast number of people who can't afford that, and payers actually will typically only pay for 3 to 5 sessions in that capacity. And there are a number of friction points, right? So, the friction points that we look at across all mental and behavioral health, because these are disorders that are 24/7. They're chronic and often relapsing. We are expecting patients to actually leave their work, leave their home, get childcare, drive across. I don't know about anybody else, but it took me 45 minutes this morning to find parking for this hospital. So if I had to do this every day, I think it'd be a little bit frustrating and causes a lot of friction. And it doesn't address, the overall need. We live in a world now where we all, and I'm seeing them on the table and in people's hands, we all have these supercomputers that are with us 24/7. And so when we deliver immersive therapeutics to somebody's device, that's what we're doing. So in the world of neuroplasticity, and Walter's actually going to touch on this a lot, right? The neuroscience of immersive technology and why and how and where it works in our brains and our bodily systems. But what we look at really is this kind of combination therapy where we're spending a bunch of time on the couch. That's actually, if you can see it, this is talk therapy plus a chemical agent. In the case of depression, this would be an SSRI plus talk therapy as really the gold standard of care. And similarly, when we're looking at behavior modification, right, there's an education framework, there's behavioral activation, and then, this becomes the gold standard of care in this world. But what we found is that digital health is really the most effective means of delivering these behavioral and mental health treatments. Just 3 examples, and some of these actually go back a little bit in time, and I'm going to turn it over to Walter here in just a second. He'll be able to tell you about some of the studies that he's been involved in. But just one example here, this is from our friends at UCSF. Nature actually had on a cover story the story of what's called NeuroRacer. A mutual friend of ours actually worked on this, Noah Falstein. If this had been a drug, this article was saying this would be $1 billion drug. The change that actually was seen with this was phenomenal. Our colleagues in Australia running a SparkX program for SPARKS, the SPARKS program for teens with refractory depression and suicidal ideation had in their outcomes, actually improvements over treatment as usual that were just phenomenal. And we can talk about a number of different reasons why that this is the case. But immersive media for health is really where we're going, and I'm going to, as I mentioned, turn it over to Walter to talk a little bit about where the VR and AR comes in. But this is a spectrum of active involvement, feedback loops, motivational systems that we're using. And one of the things that I want to note here is for a lot of these therapeutics in mental and behavioral health, there is a dose response. So the more we engage a patient in the game or therapeutic or the VR delivery system that we've prepared for them, the better their outcomes. And obviously, these are really low risk, no side effects types of therapies and interventions. Really quickly here, we tap into the emotional drivers. So traditional emotional motivation in healthcare is really around apprehension and fear, which can be a really effective motivator, but for a lot of people it causes them to just kind of put their head in the sand. You'll see here I quote Florence Nightingale, who in 1859 recognized that apprehension and fear were not really the best motivators. When we bring this into an immersive world, we're really tapping into additional emotional drivers. And one of the things I like to say is that Hollywood knows how to sway our emotions, and Las Vegas knows how to motivate us. And so we're looking
and get us addicted.
And so we're looking to really bring these to bear in what we do. In part, it's because we're wired for story, as I'm sure everybody here will recognize. The human brain is actually great at pattern recognition and pattern making. One of the things that we seek to do with healthcare is to kind of, with digital healthcare, is to kind of frame and reframe stories in this more hero's journey to empower our patients. And I'm rushing through this a little bit because we want to make sure that we have adequate time for you all to hear Walter and to have some questions. But I want to give one example of how this reframing via digital intervention actually works. This was a therapy that was developed by our friends at the Hope Lab in San Francisco. It's called Remission. It's a digital therapy for pediatric cancer patients. And I don't know if anybody here deals with pediatrics or teens, but it's a perfect storm of non-compliance. They really see their therapy as being disruptive to their lives. It's a drag. They don't want to do it. And in this game, we actually, we reframe the story of that therapy. You are now inside the body with a nanobot Roxy, our nanobot Roxy, where we're using the weapons of chemotherapy, of nutrition and balance and all of the things that the kids are supposed to be doing to battle the cancer, to fight the cancer. And one of the things that was really amazing, this was actually developed to be like a 60 hours of play with 20 levels. Even after short periods of time and intervening with this, the kids actually improved their outcomes and they improved their compliance and adherence to their therapies. And this is because, you know, we're really getting them where they live and delivering messages that resonate to help them reframe their stories. Really quickly, context in this case is storytelling. Walter's going to get into this with talking about more about VR, but just a quick example of context. It doesn't have to be, you know, Star Wars or Harry Potter. We don't have to have an epic tale that we're telling. In this case, there's an example of Donkey Kong where if you see the game mechanic, right, and the game mechanic over here is like what we currently do in healthcare. I'm going to tell you the rules, I'm going to tell you what you need to do, it's just the facts, ma'am, right? And when we layer on context, now we actually have a nemesis, right? We're trying to get up this same obstacle, but we got to beat Kong. We have a love interest. We've got actually additional motivation to get there. I mean, this is Joseph Conrad in an 8-bit world, right? You know, we're really enabling a hero's journey here. And this is what we look to do when we bring these things to people where they live. My final reason for why we deliver it in this way is this is the world that we live in. When we deliver a therapy to where a person lives, this is the modern day digital house call. And we think that it's actually going to drive and improve throughput and clinical outcomes. And for patients, it's more convenient, it's more effective, and our own clinical trials have shown the efficaciousness of these approaches over treatment as usual. For clinicians, we actually integrate this right into their workflow, right? We create triaging systems and dashboards that actually help clinicians, you know, better engage their patients. And for payers, it's more scalable, it's more affordable, and because of the outcomes that we're seeing, it's just better math. So at that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Walter, and he's going to dive more into the VR aspects.
Well, thank you, Beth. That's fantastic. I really do feel there's a revolution going on. The continents are colliding with the consumer electronics companies jumping into healthcare, working with the pharma companies, the medical device companies. The point of care for the patient is shifting to not where the hospital is, not where the clinic is, but where the individual is. And that's a tremendous change. And the interventions Beth talked about span healthcare, starting with health and wellness and going all the way to acute issues. My focus, though, has been on immersive technologies, virtual reality, AR, and also a little bit of AI technology, and we'll talk about all three during this talk. As you know, things are really changing with the VR technology world. How many of you have had a chance to be in a virtual environment? Everyone. Ooh. Wow. If I had asked this 4 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 people would have raised their hands. How many have tried a high-end virtual reality system? I mean one that's been connected to a computer as opposed to a cell phone-based one. Wow. So you guys know. You know that these environments can take you someplace else. You can have an experience in them, and they can evoke your emotions. And in behavioral medicine, if we want to change a brain system, a neural system, we need to be able to activate it. And that's one of the basic principles of cognitive behavioral therapy, but also exposure therapy and other interventions. And I'll go into examples of how that's being utilized. But my purpose now is to give an overview of what's going on. But as you know, every tech company is spending billions of dollars to get into this arena, and it's going to benefit us in the healthcare arena tremendously. Right now, the projections, and these are conservative projections, are that there'll be 70 million users of VR systems in the next 6 years. Within 3 years, 30 million users. That's enough of an installed base for us to be able to roll out some products. And by the way, when I say VR technology, I use it as a shorthand for the full spectrum of immersion. I also mean augmented reality technology, where we overlay the visual field with extra information. Sometimes we have room-based systems too, where we don't have to wear anything, but the walls have systems projected on it and we're capturing our movement. It doesn't have to be where you're wearing something on your face to have an effect. And here's my basic premise for this talk is though entertainment and social connection and gaming is going to be driving the price down for these systems and getting them out into the living room, getting them out into the home. I think one of the deepest markets in the long run for VR technology is going to be the medical arena. And all the major manufacturers of the headsets and motion capture devices appreciate this too. They realize they're not going to recoup their investment if they just go for entertainment and gaming. It has to move to the enterprise. And now's the right time. It's really evolved. Back in the day when I first got started with VR technology, our head-mounted displays were so heavy we had to counterbalance them with a brick. And the computers we used were this tall and cost $500,000. And now we can do 100 times better for something I can go down to Best Buy and purchase. So this is where I started. I had a lot more hair then. This is here at Stanford over across the street. I'm sitting on a dumpster with my colleagues. And I think the loss of hair is mostly from wearing all the HMDs over the years. But the point of talking about the fact that I got involved decades ago, and so did other colleagues, is that there's a library of research that's been done. Now granted, we use these very expensive head-mount displays that cost $70,000 each, and the computers cost $500,000, but we did research. So we know the pathways of what works, what doesn't work, where the shipwrecks are. And that's something the current generation of developers should leverage. We can go to PubMed and find studies indicating how VR can be used for stroke rehabilitation or for treating phobias, going back decades. And there are a large number of startups jumping into this arena. It's not just the tech companies developing the enabling technology, but there's a lot of groups jumping in developing applications. And I did a poll about half a year ago and found there were about 160 medical VR companies. About 40 of them are here in the Bay Area. The numbers since I did this poll have grown. And almost 20 different clinical sectors. Almost every sector of medicine is paying attention to this technology and developing interventions. The latest analysis, I think it was by Kinsey, projected a market of $5.1 billion in 2025. And that's pretty close. That's coming up pretty fast. So why now? Well, I think it's not just the VR, AR technology emerging. I think we've also had a change in our mind about things like this. As Beth pointed out, the digital health revolution is going on and changing how, and with an approval of an app by the FDA, that's a big deal. And also the technology was too expensive and too uncomfortable before. So now we're poised to move forward. And it's the full stack of medical intervention that is being affected by this. And I'll give examples of these, but starting with prevention and wellness, we have some powerful interventions there. Better assessments, more objective assessments that can be used for within subject and between subject comparisons based on behavior and other measurements, including biomarkers, better training of clinicians and of patients, improved interventions, things that help motivate staying compliant with interventions. And then because VR can be a telemedicine platform that reach into the home and where the individual is, it allows us to distribute care delivery to underserved populations. So I'll just briefly go through this so that we have time for questions, but here's some examples of how VR is being used right now for clinical training. Learning specific clinical skills, sometimes team training, surgical skills. There's a large number of systems out there now to have people rehearse an operation, plan an operation in advance rather than on the job. How to use new equipment and tools. Instead of going to these multi-million-dollar facilities to spend a couple days being learned how to use a new medical device, clinicians can learn it locally, and they can also practice right before the operation. Team training, for example, an emergency department responding to a local disaster. And it just doesn't have to be the department, it could be this whole town bringing the police force and fire department and all the EMTs to rehearse it, responding to a disaster, for example. And more importantly, I think VR allows us to sit in the viewpoint of someone else, and we can have empathy for the patients that we're working with by seeing the world from their view, or having their family members see what it's like for that person to have their particular impairment. Assessments, I think, this is the big thing. I think we're going to see a real revolution in the way we do assessments, particularly in behavioral medicine. Instead of just doing self-reports or casual observation, we'll be actually able to measure very precisely people's behavior, and we'll be able to correlate it with biomarkers that we're measuring simultaneously. This will make a big difference, but we can also do better assessments with medical image review by being able to step in and modify things of images that are collected, better capture of activities in daily living and functional measurements. And I think the big area that's going to be changed is behavioral medicine, because we can actually capture behavior. I mentioned prevention, health and wellness. We have interventions that have been shown to significantly help improve with everything on this list, helping with stress, promoting people to exercise, as a disability interface, addressing grief and isolation. This emerging VR technology, I think, will make its first inroads in the health and wellness arena, because the barriers of entry are less, and there's such an acute need, as Beth mentioned. But we also have interventions that are used right now. There's clinics that are doing this in several important clinical areas. Stroke rehabilitation is a big one, both acute in the hospital and then after discharge, home rehabilitation systems that you can get that take a very painful and boring process and make it fun or interesting or engaging. And then also data is collected and can be sent back to the clinic that measures how you're doing, so that maybe you need to come in and be trained on how to do your exercise because you plateaued at the right exercise, or maybe you need to change what you're doing. The clinician can see this now because we capture functional data. So in addition to gamifying and making stroke rehab more interesting, we can also make it more dynamic, and this may allow earlier discharge and better return to work planning. Almost every aspect of clinical care has a system that's been developed to help with it. As Beth mentioned, acute and chronic pain. I think the big areas that we're going to see a lot very soon, again because there's such a long wait list and such an acute need, is in the area of behavioral medicine. And we have interventions that have been validated, and there's a very long list here. I'm not going to read them all, but spanning the spectrum of addictions, psychosis, post-traumatic stress disorder, and phobias, generalized anxiety disorder, mild cognitive impairments, ADHD. I guess I am reading the list. The list goes on. Here's the second page. And if you don't see your favorite problem listed here, it's because I was running out of room. And again, the power of VR for this is that we can evoke a cognitive state. How many of you have had that sometimes silly demo where you're asked to walk a plank in a virtual reality environment? Okay, for those of you who haven't tried it, it's sort of a way people are demoing their research will show how powerful VR can be to evoke emotional state. They'll have people get into a virtual elevator, they go up to a top floor, it's sort of scary, and there's a plank you're supposed to walk across. And sometimes at the end of the plank, there's a kitten you're supposed to rescue. In our lab, maybe 30% of the people can't walk across that plank, even though they're talking to their friends who are in the room, even though they know they're in a room. It's just our visual system is telling us we're someplace else. And that's a powerful thing, because we can use that as a tool to teach people how to deal with not just fear of heights, but also how to rescue kittens, but also how to deal with their fears and how to deal with an addiction and their cravings. We can evoke the cognitive state of being in a bar and your friends are putting peer pressure on you and you have to practice your refusal skills and have situational confidence. That's much better than sitting in a clinician's office and they're saying, imagine this is happening. Anger management. There's a whole variety of things where if we can evoke a cognitive state, we can help modify that cognitive state. We also use VR for stress inoculation, is the phrase that we're using for this currently. And I want to describe very briefly a project we did here at the Stanford Children's Hospital called Project Braveheart. There's children who are scheduled for cardiac surgery, and they know, and their parents know, and their friends know, and their siblings know what the worst day of their life's going to be, weeks in advance, and that's the day they show up at the hospital. So what we do is we came up with a system where we have a virtual environment that runs on a cell phone so they can send it home with them, that gives them a walkthrough of the hospital. And we snuck in tour guides, other kids who had the procedure before. We green screened them in to show them around the hospital, introduce them to the clinicians, say, here's what's going to happen in the prep room, here's what's going to happen in the operating room. this might feel a little cold when they put the mask on your face. Don't worry, you can do it too. And then we snuck in some mindfulness training and some diaphragmatic breathing games to teach the kids relaxation skills in advance. We didn't call them mindfulness training. We made it a little bit more fun than that. But it worked. We were getting great results of stress knocking these children and their families before they show up at the hospital. And here's a little quick video describing the project. Maybe turn up the volume a little bit, if possible. Great.
Braveheart is an interactive VR experience developed to reduce stress levels in children who will be undergoing a surgical procedure. Patients and their families are guided through a 360-degree video tour of the hospital by a virtual companion. The gender-specific tour guide provides a friendly, approachable, and relaxing tour of the facility and introductions to doctors and key hospital staff. Along the hospital tour, patients visit the key rooms they'll encounter on the day of their procedure to help make the unknown more familiar. Children learn about parts of the procedure and can even practice mindfulness and relaxation exercises. The intuitive software design allows the user to navigate through scenes and applications, learning the hospital layout, all within Braveheart at their own pace, creating a first-of-its-kind, interactive, and immersive video environment. When Braveheart is finished, anonymous usage analytics are stored and available by scene, time, and engagement for analysis by doctors and researchers.
So that's just one example of a relatively inexpensive intervention that can be developed for almost every clinical situation to help with both patient education and disclosure of what's going to happen during the day and to reduce stress. And you can imagine it to be used for other situations too, where a scary and disturbing situation can be predicted. Beth and I are working on a project with the University of Colorado Medical Center now to help come up with a similar system to help with first responders, police, fire, and dispatch, who we can predict they're going to have some very stressful days. And so that's in process right now. I want to very briefly go over some of the neuroscience of what's going on and why these environments are so powerful and how we can leverage them. In order to change a brain system, we have to activate that system. And it's very hard in a standard clinical situation where you're talking with your patient or you're counseling a client to get them to actually evoke that cognitive state. You can ask them to do it, but it's very hard for them to do it, especially if it's disturbing or painful or uncomfortable. But with a VR system, we can do it in a staged way using the principles of exposure therapy. We can also shorten the feedback loop. We can show people their progress. We can have them do stroke rehabilitation, for example, and maybe exaggerate their range of motion as they're doing it so they get a feeling of self-confidence and give them feedback on their progress, not by showing them a bar graph, by being able to have them do something in collaboration with other people in a virtual environment dynamically. And by shortening the feedback loop, we can change people's attitudes and behavior. One of the big problems right now with weight management, or really any behavior change that we're trying to nudge people, is it takes a long time to see the results of diet, of exercise, of any of the behavior changes we're trying to encourage people to do. But within VR, we can do anything we want. We can exaggerate things and get the results. For example, one approach we're using with autism and Asperger's is to, in the virtual environment, exaggerate facial expressions, body language, nonverbal communication, so that the people who are learning social skills in the virtual environment can catch on a little bit easier, and then we gradually staircase them back to normal facial expressions and body language. And then we can also leverage the mirror neuron systems that are part of our brain. And I'll give you an example of how we do that. But in order to do this, we have to have repetition, so we have to have the ability to make it engaging and leverage some of the gamification principles that are out there. And we have to leverage the brain's reward system. We have to make it fun. That's what our reward systems do, is they facilitate neuroplasticity and changing of our brain system. So if we don't cognitively engage the individual, if we don't make it fun and rewarding, we won't see the change. Even if they do the exercise, we won't see the change unless we can leverage the brain's reward systems. And for those of you who are developing applications, and maybe some of you are game developers, one principle that is important is it's sort of the journey is the reward. It's not the process of achieving a goal that activates these reward systems. It's the pursuit part. And there's a whole decades of research showing why this is. It's, in a way, it's sort of an evolutionary ripoff. It's very hard for us to be happy in the moment. Our brains are wired to reward us for pursuing a goal, but not so much for enjoying it. Then we're sort of on to the next. And that's part of the reason that VR can be very powerful is that we can go on to the next pretty rapidly and show people results of their progress. So I mentioned mirror neuron systems. One technique we've used in our research here at Stanford is to show people the effect of their changes in their behavior on their future self. Mirror neurons cause us to understand the emotions in others and the state in others. We can also create a virtual avatar of ourselves. And there's a process we go through. It takes about 10 minutes called the Proteus process, where we have people see a virtual mirror of themselves in their avatar. And when they move, the avatar moves. When they smile, the avatar smiles. Once you've bonded with your avatar, then we can do things. And one of the things we did with Stanford undergraduates, for example, is we age progress them. And believe me, if you're 20 years old and you see yourself just 10 years older, it's sort of scary. But we gave these students real money. We said you can spend it any way you want. Those that got to meet their future self, interact with their future self, clicked on the link and put a significant amount of that money into a retirement savings account. Those that didn't see their future self had no reason to do that, and very few of them did do that. The point is, we can leverage the fact that we bond with ourselves and we want to change our behavior by shortening the feedback loop and leveraging our empathy for our future self. Okay, so here's sort of my conclusion slide. I'm trying to go through this pretty rapidly so that we have time for questions. There's a lot more to talk about, of course, but basically, the good news is, Beth described a crisis in healthcare. The good news is there's some new technology on the way. The consumer electronics companies are bringing it in to help us. And it's becoming affordable and powerful. And it's crossing over from the consumer electronics and gaming arena and entertainment arena into home health. And it's used in all aspects of medicine right now, and there are validated studies that show how to correctly use it. It will only get better as we extend those validated studies to larger populations and try and leverage the new technology, which is even more powerful than the technology that we were using 5, 10, and 15 years ago. So I think that, and I didn't really go into the fact that in addition to VR and AR technology, there's a lot of AI technology that's complementing this. The avatars that we're creating right now to be in virtual environments can be really pretty smart and savvy. And they can serve in a number of ways to help address long waiting lists. If somebody goes into a queue meeting, finally makes the call saying, I have a problem with addiction, or I have a problem with depression, and they're told they're on a 3-month waiting list. Well, we can have an avatar that can talk with them, maybe give them some feedback, maybe listen to the tone of their voice, or maybe look at their facial expressions, and then feed back to the clinician that maybe this person shouldn't be given an appointment 3 months out, maybe they should be in tomorrow. So there's a lot that's going on of emerging technology, and it's not just VR and AR, it's also AI technology. Okay, that's our presentation. Thank you very much. I think they're passing the microphones. Yes, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much. 2 quick questions. When you think about designing these technologies, this feedback loop you talk about, patients want instant gratification, they want to know how they're doing, they want short-term feedback. So how do you incorporate that when disease change can be long-term? Something like ADHD is very small improvements over time. And then secondly, we haven't really seen durability of effect past 6 months. So for some of these technologies, it'll require the patients to kind of keep going back on them. And so how do we keep them engaged? And what do we think about when designing those technologies?
I think it's a question for both of us, really. I'll start with the one of where the effects are small to measure. I think because our measurement tools in the past have been subjective and non-quantifiable and based on observation, and I suspect we will get more immediate measurements by combining biometrics with movement detection and how one behaves in environments. So for ADHD, I think we'll know almost immediately whether someone is learning a skill and can give them feedback on whether they learned it. And even if they didn't make much progress, we could still move them to the next level of learning once they've learned cognitively what to do. And how to keep them engaged. Well, Beth, you're one of the experts in that area.
Yeah, just mirroring what Walter said, one of the things that we do, and he actually even mentioned this in his talk, is we exaggerate rewards, and that actually enhances the feedback loop, right? So that the immediacy of rewards is something that's highly valuable and valued by patients across the board, because to your point, these things are often slow going, right? And we're key to these reward systems. So if I'm trying to get somebody to lose weight, the cookie has its own rewards, right? It's sweet and it has fat, and and you get that little sugar buzz, where the kale salad maybe not. But if I can actually exaggerate the reward that you're getting for that, then I can actually keep you in that behavior loop.
And we can bring in new types of rewards too. It just doesn't have to be progress in a gamification environment. It could be connecting people with other people and sharing your progress with them, and them giving feedback to you too, like, keep going, good work.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we look at when we're designing these, first of all, we examine the psychographics of the patient profile, right? What is going to be most highly motivating to them? And then with our reward system, we largely draw from intrinsic rewards. Am I looking to change and shift a self-identity and make you feel good about yourself, which is actually always a place to start, as well as extrinsic rewards. And to what Walter's talking about, we work with Sandy Pentland in the Human Behavior Lab at MIT. Sandy's actually an advisor for us at Pear, and we engage with him and his research, and they look at a construct called social physics, where if I'm actually responsible in and of myself and just for myself, I may not actually do that just for myself, but if there are other people that are counting on me to do that in this kind of social construct, I'm much more likely to actually comply and be adherent.
Next cool question. Who has the microphone? Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation today. I think it was really great and exciting seeing a lot of the clinical evidence for impact coming to the forefront now. Could you speak a little bit about the business models that are next in line supporting this, and is it existing business models or new business models? But I'd be curious to know. Thank you.
I think we both have an answer to that one too.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll kick it off because I was asked just recently to be specific about some of the business models. And there's probably 10 different pathways. And although my premise is that this technology is poised to move into the healthcare arena, that question begs how. And we know why, because we can get better results and reduce costs. But how do we do it? And I think some pathways are direct to consumer. For example, stroke rehabilitation. If I'm sent home post-discharge, I may subscribe for $10 a month to something that makes my rehabilitation a little bit more accurate and interesting. I think the other pathway, as we demonstrate improved efficacy, is sort of the standard reimbursement, a pathway through the healthcare system. I think there's also some hybrid models in between there that are out there. But because, as the friction for doing this becomes less, with technology being in people's homes and in their living rooms and on their watches and in their back pockets, it's going to be a lot easier to do this with a new model of business that will transform how healthcare is delivered. Beth, what are your thoughts?
I agree completely. And I think that one of the things that we have to look at as entrepreneurs is that the business model needs to be mimetic to the etiology that we're addressing and how we're addressing it. So, Walter's right, there are 10 plus business models that are out there that are really effective. He actually has been a CEO of a company that sold directly to hospitals, and then they would resell. And what we do at Pear is on a per patient per month basis, tapping into payers. But I think that there are multiple different models that we look at that are integrated into clinical workflows. I think the most challenging is direct to consumer, but not that can't work. And one of the things that I've actually even seen recently in stroke rehab is that CMS, so the folks that pay Medicaid and Medicare, are actually paying for some of these things that would have been direct to consumer. And so we have a company that we're working with that's been funded here out of the Bay Area that actually has some stroke rehab where Medicaid and Medicare are their largest reimbursers for that. But it's something that you've got to, when you have your model, take a look at all of the various opportunities that are there. One final thing about that, we actually have a colleague who is at another health startup and has been kind of, in urging all of us to take a look at the Google models. Right here we have one of the largest companies in the world that never charges consumers a dime, and yet is still, multi-billion-dollar a year company. And I think that as we're innovating in this field, we need to innovate in those arenas as well.
I think, practically speaking, it's going to depend on what the medical device and the pharmaceutical companies decide to do in terms of digital healthcare. They have the channel. They've got the funding to do the validation studies, and they have the salespeople on the ground to push things out. They know how to do this. So when the digital health companies, when the pharmaceutical companies start adopting, as they have in combination with paratherapeutics, combination therapy, that's when what's poised to go forward will go forward through that business model. And some new ones that will be developed too. I think that, and it is happening, there's a large number of these groups that are starting to put together products that leverage digital health technology.
Hi, so I'm Amy Lee, I'm a stage 4 cancer survivor, started a company called Dance for Healing. It's an AI and telehealth company really trying to make behavior change a little bit easier for patients like myself who's stuck at home often, and then the elderly, and by bringing creative arts therapy to their house. So we actually, so far our platform is on telehealth and there's pre-recorded video. But we did won the first prize in AI for the Stanford Health Plus Hackathon, which is a VR presentation. All these prototypes mock up and stuff. It was pretty funny. So far we haven't implemented that yet. Our major concern is because our population are vulnerable. These are chronic patients and elderly. And when you're wearing the goggles, the VR, you're in this immersive environment. How do you ensure the safeties, for these user cases? I'm very excited to, hear from someone like you who's working in this field for 25 years, and you also validated this is definitely beneficial for people for wellness and exercise. So I'd love to hear that.
It's an excellent question. I think that I would look at AR technology for that. I think when we use VR, the fully immersive, or looked at mixed reality technology. These terms are still evolving, but we find clinically blocking out the outside world is really important when you're dealing with trauma, with post-traumatic stress or with pain, other issues where you need to have the patients fully attentive. But as the gaming arena has shown, just looking at a flat screen, you can still get cognitive engagement without being fully immersed. And the emerging AR technologies are actually pretty cool and pretty fun. They're getting there. And they're inexpensive. They can be on your cell phone or your tablet. And I think that's what I would recommend you take a look at for what you're doing.
Great. My second question is kind of related to the business. I have a couple of friends in the AR VR space, and so far it's been told none of these companies making money yet. I don't know how Pear is, and can you explain why?
I think Pear's going to go public soon. There's a number of other groups out there too that are making money, and MindMaze just raised a second $100 million round at a $2 billion valuation. So there's a lot of venture money flowing in, and there are companies that are making money. So, but you're right. But it's an early stage. These are early seed stage and A stage companies by and large. But they're getting there. But Beth, what do you think?
I think one of the things that we have to consider is, so we are not Lumosity, and the companies that we represent are not in that kind of direct-to-consumer wellness model. So when you're considering these types of companies, it's better to consider them more like an extension of a pharmaceutical or a traditional medical device company, where there's a lot of cash investment that has to be made up front, and then you actually, as you're getting into commercialization, you have an opportunity to tap into the multi-trillions of dollars. I mean, healthcare is a multi-trillion-dollar a year industry in the U.S. alone. Healthcare and education are really the two, right? And around the world. And so while we haven't seen like huge amounts of revenues yet, think about like how pharma companies go. And their model is traditionally, $1 billion in 10 years to market, and maybe they have a hit. But when they have a hit, you've got a drug like Lipitor that's itself has made $1/3 of $1 trillion. So I think there are opportunities like that.
And I would recommend exploring that concept of teaming with some of these existing companies in the medical device arena. and the pharmaceutical arena. One company, Penumbra, which is a public stroke mitigation company, has decided to make a real big play in medical VR. They're going to be looking for little companies to team with and to leverage their channel. So I don't think you have to do all the work. I think your investors do want to hear how you're going to answer this question. So, but there are answers.
I guess it's an extension of the safety question, but it's more of a tolerance question. In your experience and research experience, have you encountered anyone who can't tolerate VR or AR? And if so, do you have any advice for companies that are starting in those areas where not to go in terms of therapy?
Well, back in the day, we had something that was called the barphogenic zone, and it's actually a technical phrase. You can find it, and there's a certain frequency of refresh rate in the displays that if you were below that, you definitely would make people nauseous. But we're over that threshold now. A good system that's adjusted properly, I haven't seen anyone who's had much trouble, if at all. Maybe there's a little discomfort if it's not positioned right in their head and there's not time to calibrate. And believe me, I think we're in the 300 baud modem stage right now. The technology we're seeing, we know what it can do, but in 4 years, it's going to be so much better, so much more comfortable. We'll have systems where we can project information onto our eyes instead of weighing something, or we'll have glasses-like systems. But I think it shouldn't be a problem. I don't know what your group is. If you're working with people who are going through chemotherapy, who are probably a little nauseous anyhow, then you might have problems. But I think in general, a good VR system should be above that threshold for you.
Great. Well, I think that we are standing between you and your lunch break. So I know that there were a few other questions. Walter and I will certainly be here. And
Can I take 2 more minutes because you guys started late?
Oh.
Okay, yeah, yay, please, thank you.
Oh,
Let's
great,
take 5.
okay.
Can we have 5? Thanks.
So the boss has
All right.
2 more questions.
Okay,
Great.
all right.
Hi, thanks so much for being here today. I find this really fascinating. One thing that I was considering as you were speaking about this was that with virtual and augmented reality, you obviously need content, and in order to receive content, and great content, and effective content, you need artists, which means that we're seeing in this particular field 2 sort of disparate industries coming together. And I'm just wondering what your opinions are about where this relationship in particular is headed, and how these things can be further integrated, both in a clinical setting and perhaps outside of a clinical setting as well.
Yeah, happy to tackle that. My first degree is actually in filmmaking, and now I've been involved in starting a number of digital medicine companies, and so I think a lot about the role of the artist and the role of the designer in great content. And I mentioned earlier, there is this dose response for these therapeutics. So the longer that we get people engaged into play, the better the outcomes are, right? The better the clinical outcomes. So what I do and what we've done in the companies that we worked with, and Walter mentioned the National Mental Health Innovation Center and Paratherapeutics where we work together, is we actually create these kind of, combined agile teams, right? So we have a clinician and a subject matter expert, key opinion leader that actually understands the etiology. We often will bring in patients with the artist, designer, and so for me too, design is not about the look and feel, it's about how it makes a person think, feel, and behave, right? It's a whole construct of what we're trying to do. So with these agile teams, that we always have clinicians and clinical leads, design leads, and product and engineering. So we start from the get-go with trying to represent all of those folks.
Well, and just as the major consumer electronics companies are coming into the healthcare arena, what I'm seeing, and a lot of the startups that I find are going into the medical arena, they're coming from the Hollywood special effects arena. They have these great artistic skills of building 3D environments that have been used for filmmaking. Now that they can be migrated over to other platforms for healthcare, they're jumping in too. So yes, studios and artists are a big part of the product development process. Otherwise, it's going to fail.
Thank you.
Hi, Simran, and I've opened a couple of psychiatric and addiction clinics, and so this is very interesting to me, the technology that you're using. I'm curious about, a lot of the positive side effects have been talked about, but when you talk about things like empathy and being able to be put into the shoes of others, what are some of the risks or what are some of the negative side effects you've seen?
Good question. I'll start, and I know you've got an opinion too. Well, for one thing, we don't know what the effect on the developing visual system is of spending a lot of time in a virtual environment. We will know eventually. I'm sure there are parents who unfortunately have to work 3 jobs and they're going to park their kids. And even though the system may say not suitable for children under 13, they'll still be using it. And I worry about that. There's an accommodation issue also for us using. We're fooling the visual system by having a screen right a couple inches away from the eyes, and there's a convergence accommodation discrepancy that could cause some discomfort over long-term use. So I usually don't have people in a virtual environment longer than 20 minutes for that reason. I don't know what the long-term health effects are, and I would love to see someone help us do some research in that study, in that area, because it's important. That being said, most of the things we've talked about, I think the risk is less than the possibilities. I think, especially for some of the clinical situations, for those children who are going in for cardiac surgery, I wasn't worried about the negative side effects of them using VR, because I thought the positive effects were going to really exceed it. And so in general, that's my position on this. What do you think, Beth?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that, one of the things is, as we submit things to the FDA as well, we need to look at the risk profile. And it's not only the risk profile of the technology, it's the risk profile because, as folks were saying, that we have an at-risk population that we're putting this technology in the hands of or on the faces of. So one of the things that's wonderful is we actually get to stand on the shoulders of giants as we're doing this. Walter included here, Walter and colleagues Jaron Lanier and some of these others that were in the photo here at Stanford have long done a bunch of research on the negative impacts. So the vergence accommodation impact is the thing of, focusing too closely, the nausea, but there are actually even kind of railing systems around people, so both for entertainment as well as for healthcare. And I think that, the longer term effects are things that we will have to continue to study, right? I mean, if we can get people to change their minds and and enhance a diet or to save for the future, obviously this is, it's got some other possibilities of we're going to be able to convince people to do other things with this and in this world. But I think that our job as researchers and entrepreneurs is to, be mindful always of the risks and to move forward in any of
But a lot of data is going to be sent up to the cloud of what people are doing in these virtual environments. And we can use some big data analytics to look for health risk and changes in behavior. So I think if we get our act together, we can study these systems pretty, and remember, it's Apple, Google, Samsung, all these large companies want to get this technology out there. They don't want to have a major health issue. They're going to have a huge amount of analytic power behind this. So I think it's an addressable problem, but it is a concern.
Can we end here?
Great, thank you.